Rejected by her own parents and thrown into misery, she sheltered a gravely injured stranger, never imagining he was the most feared Duke of the North, and that one night would change her life forever. The rain fell like frozen needles across the northern Irish countryside, each drop a sharp reminder that winter had not yet loosened its grip on the land. Evangeline pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the cold seep through the worn wool as if it were no barrier at all. Her left leg throbbed with each uneven step, the old injury from childhood fever making itself known as it always did when the weather turned cruel. Behind her, the cottage that had been her home for 3 years grew smaller in the darkness. She did not look back. There was nothing left to see, only the faces of people who had taken her in out of duty, fed her out of obligation, and cast her out without explanation when that obligation became inconvenient. The Ashfords had given her no reason, no chance to defend herself or gather more than what she could carry. Just the sharp words spoken in hushed tones, the pointing toward the door, and the finality of it turning shut behind her. In her arms she clutched a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, her only true inheritance. Inside lay a water-stained journal filled with careful notations in fading ink, pressed flowers between yellowed pages, and sketches of plants drawn in Marta's steady hand. The old healer had been the closest thing to a mother Evangeline had ever known, raising her in the spaces between villages where suspicious eyes couldn't follow. Marta had taught her which leaves soothed fever, which roots drew poison from wounds, which combinations of herbs could ease a laboring mother's pain or help a sleepless child find rest. Alongside the journal sat a leather pouch containing dried herbs, chamomile, willow bark, yarrow, comfrey, and a small vial of honey that had somehow survived the hurried packing. These were her tools, her knowledge made tangible, the only things that had ever made her feel useful in a world that seemed determined to remind her she didn't belong. The muddy road stretched endlessly ahead, marked only by the occasional stone fence or twisted hawthorn tree. Evangeline had no destination, only the need to put distance between herself and the place that had rejected her. Her shoes, already worn thin, squelched through puddles that reflected nothing but darkness. The weight of her small possessions felt heavier with each step, though she knew it was not the physical burden that made her shoulders ache. She had been cast out before. When Marta died, she had wandered until the Ashfords took her in, their charity extended like a rope to a drowning woman. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that this time would be different. That making herself useful, staying quiet and grateful, would be enough to earn her place. The bitter taste of that miscalculation filled her mouth now, mixing with the metallic tang of rain on her lips. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the road ahead for one brilliant moment. In that instant, Evangeline saw something that made her stumble, a dark shape lying motionless beside the path and nearby, a large horse shifting restlessly in the storm. As thunder rolled across the hills, she hesitated. Every instinct told her to keep walking, to preserve what little strength she had for her own survival. The world had taken enough from her, surely she owed it nothing in return. But even as these thoughts crossed her mind, her feet were already carrying her forward. Marta's voice echoed in her memory, "The plants don't choose who deserves healing, child. They simply heal. That is their nature, and it must be ours as well." Evangeline knelt beside the fallen figure, her knees sinking into the cold mud. Rain plastered her dark hair to her face as she reached out with trembling fingers to search for a pulse. There, weak but present, a flutter of life beneath skin that felt burning hot despite the cold night. The man's breathing was labored, each exhale accompanied by a sound that spoke of fluid gathering in the lungs. Without conscious thought, her hands moved to her bundle, fingers finding the familiar shapes of her healing supplies. The storm raged around them both, but in that moment, kneeling in the mud beside a stranger who might not live to see dawn, Evangeline felt something she had almost forgotten, the quiet certainty of purpose. Working through the storm with practiced efficiency, Evangeline assessed the stranger's condition as Marta had taught her. His fever burned like a forge, but it was the rattling in his chest that concerned her most. Pneumonia or something close to it, the kind of lung sickness that could steal a man's life in a single night if left untreated. She opened her pouch with careful fingers, selecting what she could spare. Time for the chest congestion, willow bark to break the fever, and elderflower to help him sweat out the poison in his blood. With no fire to heat water, she was forced to improvise, crushing the herbs between 2 smooth stones she found by the roadside, mixing them with rainwater collected in her cupped palms, and creating a crude but potent poultice. The man stirred as she pressed the remedy against his chest, his eyelids fluttering but never quite opening. In the intermittent lightning, she caught glimpses of his face, angular features marked by what seemed like permanent severity, dark hair plastered to a high forehead, and clothes that, even soaked and muddied, spoke of quality far beyond her experience. The fabric beneath her hands felt like nothing she had ever touched, and his boots were made of leather so fine it seemed almost sinful. "Easy now," she whispered, though she doubted he could hear her over the storm. "You're burning up, but I've got something to help." She positioned herself between him and the worst of the wind, using her own body as a shield while she worked. Her shawl, inadequate as it was, she draped over his chest to keep the poultice in place. The cold bit into her shoulders immediately, but she had endured worse. The ache in her bad leg grew more insistent as she knelt in the mud, but she pushed the discomfort aside and began to sing, old Gaelic songs Marta had taught her, melodies that seemed to carry their own healing power. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Evangeline monitored his pulse, reapplied the poultice when the rain washed it away, and continued her vigil as exhaustion crept through her bones. Several times, his breathing became so shallow she thought he might slip away entirely, but each time she managed to rouse him with gentle pressure on his chest or by calling softly in his ear. As false dawn began to gray the eastern sky, she felt the change. His breathing deepened, became less labored. The fever broke suddenly, leaving him drenched in sweat but breathing clearly for the first time since she'd found him. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she nearly collapsed, only then realizing how much of her own strength she had poured into keeping him alive. It was then that she heard them, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at speed, growing louder despite the storm's continued assault. Evangeline looked up to see torches cutting through the early morning gloom, their light reflecting off metal and leather as a group of mounted men approached. The riders wore colors she didn't recognize, deep blues and silver that seemed too rich for local nobility, yet mixed with symbols that spoke of Irish allegiance. "There," one of them shouted, spurring his horse forward. "His Grace. We found His Grace." They dismounted in a rush of clanking metal and urgent voices, surrounding the fallen man with military precision. Evangeline scrambled backward, suddenly aware of how she must appear, a bedraggled woman kneeling over an unconscious nobleman, her hands stained with herbal remedies that might look like something far more sinister to suspicious minds. "Step away from him," commanded a man who seemed to be their leader, his hand resting meaningfully on the hilt of his sword. His eyes swept over Evangeline with obvious distrust, taking in her ragged clothes, her muddied state, and the small pouch of herbs still clutched in her hands. "He was dying," Evangeline said, her voice hoarse from the long night's work. "I found him like this, sick with fever and lung congestion. I've been treating him." "Treating him?" The leader's voice carried a dangerous edge. "With what?" Before she could answer, one of the other men had seized her herb pouch, emptying its contents onto the ground. The carefully prepared remedies scattered in the mud, and Evangeline's heart sank as she watched hours of work destroyed in seconds. "Poison," someone muttered. "Look at this, wolfsbane nightshade." "That's not," Evangeline began, but rough hands were already binding her wrists behind her back. "Those are healing herbs," she protested desperately. "Thyme, willow bark, elderflower. Ask any wise woman, any midwife. I saved his life." But her words fell on deaf ears. The men were already lifting their lord, their grace they had called him, which meant he was a duke, onto a hastily constructed stretcher. In the growing light, Evangeline caught a clearer glimpse of his face and felt her breath catch. Even unconscious, even pale from illness, there was something commanding about his features, a sense of power that made the deference of his men suddenly understandable. As they prepared to depart, the leader turned back to her with cold eyes. "You'll come with us, woman. His Grace will decide what's to be done with you when he wakes, if he wakes." The implication hung heavy in the air as they loaded her onto one of the horses, her wrists still bound, her fate now tied to the survival of a man whose name she didn't even know. The journey to Ravender Castle passed in a blur of discomfort and growing dread. Evangeline rode behind one of the guards, her bound hands making it impossible to steady herself as the horse navigated the rough terrain. Each jolt sent fresh pain through her injured leg, but she bit back any sound of complaint, sensing that showing weakness would only worsen her situation. As they traveled, the landscape gradually transformed. The humble cottages and scattered farms of her familiar world gave way to increasingly grand estates, their stone walls and iron gates speaking of wealth beyond her comprehension. When Ravender Castle finally came into view, rising from the mist like something from a dark fairy tale, Evangeline felt her remaining courage falter. The castle was massive, its gray towers piercing the cloudy sky like accusatory fingers. Ancient walls bore the weathered crests of noble houses, while newer additions showed the architectural influence of foreign lands. It was a fortress built to intimidate as much as to protect, and as they passed through its gates, Evangeline couldn't shake the feeling that she was entering a place from which she might never emerge. The courtyard bustled with activity as word of the Duke's condition spread. Servants hurried to prepare chambers, physicians arrived with their leather bags and stern faces, and the air filled with urgent whispers. Evangeline was largely ignored in the chaos, which gave her the opportunity to observe and listen. She learned that the Duke was Nathaniel de Ravender, a man whose name carried weight even among the servants. They spoke of him with a mixture of respect and fear, describing a lord who ruled with iron discipline but also with fairness. More telling were the things they didn't say, the way conversations stopped when certain topics arose, the careful neutrality in their voices when they mentioned his late wife. "Take her to the holding chamber in the servants' quarters," ordered the captain of the guard, his attention already turning to more pressing matters. "Post a guard. She doesn't speak to anyone until His Grace is conscious and can question her himself." The holding chamber turned out to be a small, windowless room that had clearly been designed for storing supplies rather than housing prisoners. A single narrow bed occupied one wall, while a small table and chair completed the sparse furnishing. The door, when it closed behind her, made a sound that spoke of solid oak and iron reinforcement. Evangeline sank onto the bed, her body finally acknowledging the exhaustion that had been building through the long night and difficult journey. Her wrists, finally freed from their bonds, bore red marks that would likely bruise. Her leg throbbed with a persistence that made her fear the cold and wet had caused lasting damage. But it was the uncertainty that truly wore at her, the knowledge that her fate rested entirely in the hands of a man she had never properly met. Hours passed in uncomfortable solitude. A servant brought her a bowl of thin soup and a heel of bread, but no words were exchanged. The woman's eyes held curiosity rather than hostility, but she clearly had strict orders about maintaining silence. Evangeline ate gratefully, realizing she hadn't had a proper meal since the previous morning, before the Ashfords had cast her out. As afternoon faded to evening, she heard increased activity in the corridors outside her door. Footsteps hurried past, voices called out instructions, and somewhere in the distance she could hear what sounded like heated debate. Her stomach twisted with anxiety as she wondered whether the Duke's condition had worsened, and what that might mean for her own survival. It was well past midnight when the door finally opened. The same captain who had arrested her entered, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. Behind him stood a stern-faced woman in dark clothes who could only be the head housekeeper, someone whose authority was written in every line of her posture. "His Grace has awakened," the captain announced without preamble. "He's asking to see you." Evangeline rose unsteadily, her injured leg having stiffened during the long hours of sitting. The housekeeper, Pembroke, she heard someone call her, stepped forward with a bundle of clean clothes. "You'll make yourself presentable first," Pembroke said crisply. "Whatever you are, you'll not appear before His Grace looking like something dragged from a ditch." The clothes were simple but clean, a plain brown dress, fresh undergarments, and a cap to contain her unruly hair. They fit reasonably well, suggesting that Pembroke had considerable experience in judging such things at a glance. When Evangeline emerged from behind the screen where she had changed, she saw something that might have been approval flicker in the older woman's eyes. "Remember," Pembroke said as they prepared to leave the room, "His Grace is not a man given to sentiment. He values truth above all else, but he has little patience for excuses or pleading. Answer his questions directly and honestly, and you may yet see another sunrise." The words were hardly comforting, but Evangeline nodded her understanding. As they made their way through corridors lit by torches and lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, she steeled herself for what was to come. The Duke's chamber was larger than any room Evangeline had ever entered, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that flickered with the light of a dozen candles. Heavy tapestries depicting hunting scenes and battle victories covered the stone walls, while a massive fireplace cast dancing light across Persian carpets that probably cost more than most people saw in a lifetime. The air smelled of beeswax, leather, and something medicinal that she recognized as the lingering traces of the physician's work. Nathaniel de Ravender sat propped against pillows in a bed that could have housed a family, but despite his obvious weakness, there was nothing diminished about his presence. His dark eyes fixed on her the moment she entered, sharp and assessing in a way that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. The fever had left him pale, but the angular planes of his face remained commanding, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. "Approach," he commanded, and Evangeline obeyed, her limp more pronounced now that she was conscious of his scrutiny. She stopped at what seemed a respectful distance, clasping her hands before her to keep them from trembling. "The physicians tell me I should have died," he said without preamble, his gaze never leaving her face. "They say the congestion in my lungs was severe enough to kill a horse, and that without immediate treatment, I would not have lasted until dawn." He paused, letting the words settle between them. "Yet here I am, alive and recovering, thanks to the intervention of a woman my guards found kneeling over my unconscious body in the middle of a storm." Evangeline remained silent, sensing that he wasn't finished. "They also tell me," he continued, his tone growing colder, "that the herbs they found in your possession included several that can be poisonous in the wrong combinations. So I find myself faced with an interesting puzzle. Did you save my life, or were you interrupted in the process of ending it?" "I saved your life, Your Grace," Evangeline said quietly, meeting his gaze despite every instinct that told her to look away. "Though I understand why you might doubt it." "Do you?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Then enlighten me. Why would a stranger risk her own safety to help a man she'd never met? What possible benefit could you have gained from spending the entire night in a storm, using your own supplies to treat someone who might have been a brigand or worse?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she couldn't fully grasp. Evangeline took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Because someone needed help and I knew how to give it," she said simply. "That's what I was taught, that healing isn't about deserving or not deserving. It's about need and ability, nothing more." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Who taught you this philosophy?" "Marta," Evangeline replied, her voice softening with memory. "She was a healer, a wise woman who raised me. She said that the plants don't choose who they heal, they simply heal because that's their nature." "And you believe this?" "I do, Your Grace." Nathaniel was quiet for so long that Evangeline began to wonder if he had fallen asleep, but his eyes remained fixed on her face with unsettling intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My guards believe you're either a poisoner or a fortune hunter. My physicians admit your treatment was effective but insist it was dangerous to attempt without proper training. My housekeeper thinks you're either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish." He shifted slightly in the bed, wincing as the movement pulled at muscles still tender from his illness. "What I want to know is why you didn't simply continue on your way. You were obviously traveling somewhere when you found me. Where were you going?" Evangeline hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Nowhere in particular, Your Grace. I had just been asked to leave my previous situation. I was looking for somewhere new to settle." "Asked to leave?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "By whom?" "The family that had taken me in. The Ashfords." She saw no recognition in his face at the name. "They gave no explanation, just told me to go." "I see." He was quiet again, but she sensed calculation behind his silence. "And now you find yourself here, having saved the life of a duke, awaiting judgment for either heroism or attempted murder." "Yes, Your Grace." "Here is what will happen," Nathaniel said with sudden decisiveness. "You will remain here until I am fully recovered. You will continue to assist in my treatment, under the supervision of my physicians. In exchange, you will receive room, board, and payment for your services. When I am well, we will reassess your situation." Evangeline felt her breath catch. "Your Grace, This is not charity," he interrupted sharply. "This is a business arrangement. You have skills I can use and I have resources you need. Nothing more, nothing less." But as she curtsied her acceptance, Evangeline caught something in his eyes that suggested the arrangement might be more complex than he was willing to admit. The chamber Evangeline was given occupied a space between the servants' quarters and the family wing, neither properly upstairs nor down, a physical manifestation of her uncertain status within the castle's hierarchy. It was small but comfortable, with a narrow window that looked out over the kitchen gardens and a fireplace that actually provided warmth. For someone who had spent the previous night sleeping in mud, it felt almost luxurious. Pembroke appeared the next morning with a selection of simple dresses and serviceable fabrics, all in muted colors that would mark Evangeline as neither servant nor lady. The housekeeper's manner was brisk but not unkind as she explained the rules that would govern Evangeline's stay. "You'll take your meals in the small dining room adjacent to His Grace's chambers," Pembroke said, her hands busy arranging the new clothes in the room's single wardrobe. "Not with the servants, not with the family. You'll attend His Grace twice daily, morning and evening, to assist with his treatment. The rest of your time is your own, but you're not to wander the castle without purpose, and you're absolutely forbidden from entering the family quarters uninvited. I understand, Evangeline said, though she sensed there was more behind these arrangements than simple practicality. Do you? Pembroke turned to face her, gray eyes sharp with assessment. Let me be clear about something, girl. His Grace may have agreed to this arrangement, but that doesn't make you part of this household. You're here to serve a temporary purpose, nothing more. Don't mistake necessity for belonging, and don't allow yourself to develop ideas above your station. The warning was delivered without particular malice, but it carried the weight of experience. Evangeline nodded her understanding, though something in her chest tightened at the casual dismissal. Her first official day as the Duke's temporary healer began with morning rounds. Dr. Whitmore, the castle's physician, was a thin, scholarly man who clearly resented having his authority questioned by a woman with no formal training. However, he couldn't argue with results, and Nathaniel's improvement under Evangeline's care had been remarkable. The congestion is almost completely cleared, Whitmore admitted grudgingly as they examined their patient. Whatever combination of herbs she used was surprisingly effective. Nathaniel, who seemed much stronger than he had the previous evening, submitted to their examination with poorly concealed impatience. Then perhaps we can discuss when I'll be able to return to my normal duties? Not for at least another week, Your Grace, Whitmore said firmly. The fever took more out of you than you care to admit, and pneumonia has a way of recurring if not properly treated. Evangeline watched the interplay between doctor and patient, noting the way Nathaniel's jaw tightened at any suggestion of limitation. She had seen this before in patients, particularly men accustomed to authority, who viewed illness as a personal failing rather than a natural occurrence. After Whitmore left, she remained to prepare the Duke's morning tisane, a blend of herbs designed to continue clearing his lungs while supporting his overall recovery. As she worked, grinding dried elderflower with practiced motions, she became aware of his scrutiny. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, nodding toward her hands. "From Marta mostly. Though she learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers." Evangeline poured hot water over the herbs, releasing their aromatic steam. "Knowledge passes from woman to woman in my world, Your Grace. We learn by watching, by trying, by making mistakes." "And what mistakes have you made?" The question was asked casually, but Evangeline sensed genuine curiosity behind it. She considered her answer carefully. "Many. I once nearly poisoned a colicky baby by using too much fennel in a digestive tea. Another time I tried to treat a broken bone with herbs alone, when what was needed was proper setting by someone with surgical skill." She strained the tisane through clean cloth, the golden liquid catching the morning light. "Marta said mistakes were part of learning as long as you learned from them. Wise woman, you're Marta." She was. Evangeline handed him the cup, their fingers brushing briefly as he accepted it. "She died 2 years ago. That's when the Ashfords took me in." "And why did they cast you out?" The question came without warning, and Evangeline found herself meeting his steady gaze. "I don't know, Your Grace. They never said." Something shifted in his expression. Not disbelief, but a kind of recognition that made her wonder what experiences had taught him about sudden rejection. "Drink this while it's hot," she said, stepping back to maintain proper distance. "It will help clear the last of the congestion from your chest." As he sipped the bitter brew without complaint, Evangeline began gathering her supplies. This was the part of her day she had come to anticipate with a mixture of comfort and unease. These quiet moments when the formalities of rank seemed to soften, replaced by something more fundamental. The simple interaction between healer and patient, between two people acknowledging mutual humanity. It was dangerous territory, she knew. Pembroke's warning echoed in her mind, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to remember that this was temporary. By the end of her first week at Ravender Castle, Evangeline had settled into a routine that felt both comfortable and precarious. Her mornings began in the kitchen gardens, where the head gardener had grudgingly allowed her to tend a small patch of medicinal herbs. The work was familiar and soothing, reminding her of quieter times with Marta, and she found that her hands remembered the old rhythms even when her mind was troubled. The Duke's recovery progressed steadily under her care, though she noticed he pushed himself harder than wisdom suggested. Each day he attempted more activity, spent longer hours dealing with estate business, and chafed visibly at any suggestion that he needed rest. Dr. Whitmore had begun to defer to her judgment on matters of the Duke's daily care, a development that clearly rankled the man but which he could not argue against given the evidence of improvement. It was during one of these morning sessions that Nathaniel made an observation that caught her off guard. "You favor your left leg more when you're tired," he said without preamble, his eyes following her movements as she prepared his morning treatment. An old injury? Evangeline paused in her work, surprised by his attention to such details. From childhood fever, Your Grace. It damaged something in the bone, left it weaker than the other. Does it pain you? Sometimes. When the weather turns or when I've been on my feet too long. She resumed her preparations, uncomfortable with the personal nature of the conversation. It's an old companion by now. Yet you knelt in the mud for an entire night, despite the pain it must have caused you. There was something in his tone that made her look up, meeting eyes that held an expression she couldn't quite read. As I said, Your Grace, someone needed help. Yes, he said quietly. You did say that. The conversation stayed with her as she went about her other duties that day. There had been something almost vulnerable in the way he'd asked about her leg, as though her physical limitation meant something to him beyond mere medical curiosity. She found herself wondering what other observations he had made about her, what other details he had catalogued without her awareness. It was that afternoon that she encountered the castle's other wounded soul. She was returning from the gardens when she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it entirely. Crying, but muffled, as though the person making it was trying desperately not to be heard. Following the sound, she found herself outside a door slightly ajar, revealing a chamber decorated for a child but feeling oddly empty despite the abundance of toys and books. Curled in the window seat was a small boy, perhaps 6 years old, with dark hair and the kind of delicate features that spoke of noble breeding. He wore fine clothes that had been carefully maintained but somehow looked too large for his thin frame. His crying was the heartbroken sound of someone who had learned that tears brought no comfort. Evangeline hesitated in the doorway, uncertain of her welcome. She had heard whispers among the servants about His Grace's ward, a child who had come to live at the castle under tragic circumstances, but no one spoke of him directly, and she had not encountered him during her time there. "Hello," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. The boy's head snapped up, revealing eyes that were startlingly similar to the Duke's but filled with a wariness that no child should possess. He stared at her for a long moment, clearly debating whether to speak or flee. "I don't know you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Evangeline agreed, stepping just inside the threshold but coming no closer. "My name is Evangeline. I'm helping to care for your uncle while he recovers from being ill." Uncle Nat was sick? The boy's eyes widened with sudden fear. Is he going to die too? The question hit Evangeline like a physical blow, revealing in an instant the depth of loss this child had already experienced. "No, sweetheart. He's getting better. He was very sick for a while, but he's much stronger now." Relief flickered across the boy's face, followed quickly by a return of that careful wariness. "I'm Teo," he said after a moment. "It's very nice to meet you, Teo. That's a strong name." He nodded solemnly, then seemed to retreat back into himself. Evangeline remained where she was, sensing that any sudden movement might send him fleeing like a startled deer. In the silence, she became aware of how quiet the room was. No sounds of play, no evidence that this child had ever laughed within these walls. "Would you like to hear a story?" she asked gently. "I know some very good ones about brave knights and clever foxes and gardens where magical things grow." Teo considered this offer with the gravity of someone much older than his years. "Will Uncle Nat mind if you tell me stories instead of taking care of him?" "I think Uncle Nat would want you to have stories," Evangeline said with certainty she didn't entirely feel. "Good stories are important medicine too." For the first time since she'd entered the room, Teo's expression softened just slightly. The story Evangeline chose was one of Marta's favorites, about a young fox who discovered he could understand the language of healing plants, and how he used this gift to help the other creatures of the forest. She told it simply, without dramatic flourishes, letting the gentle rhythm of the words create their own magic. Teo listened with the intense focus of a child starved for such attention, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before asking, could the fox really understand what the plants were saying? "What do you think?" Evangeline asked, settling more comfortably in the chair she had quietly claimed during the telling. "I think." Teo paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think maybe plants do talk but only special people can hear them. Like how Uncle Nat says horses talk to him but not with words." The insight surprised her with its wisdom. "Your uncle is good with horses?" "The best," Teo said with the first real animation she had seen from him. "He has a big black stallion named Thunder who doesn't like anyone else, but Uncle Nat can make him do anything just by talking to him. Papa used to say Uncle Nat was half horse himself." His face fell suddenly as he realized what he had said, the brief moment of enthusiasm dissolving back into careful neutrality. Evangeline felt her heart ache for this child who carried such careful boundaries around his grief. Your papa sounds like he knew your uncle well. Papa was his little brother, Teo said quietly. Mama said they used to get in trouble together when they were boys, always racing their horses too fast and climbing trees that were too tall. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But now Papa's gone and Mama too, and I'm not supposed to talk about them because it makes people sad. The revelation hit Evangeline like a physical blow. No wonder this child seemed so lost, so carefully contained. He had been taught to hide his grief, to spare the feelings of others, to swallow his natural need to remember and speak of those he had lost. It's all right to talk about them, she said gently. People we love don't disappear just because they've died. They live on in our memories, in the stories we tell about them. Teo looked at her with something that might have been hope, but also wariness, as though he had been hurt before by adults who promised things they couldn't deliver. Nurse Hartwell says I mustn't dwell on the past. She says it's not healthy for a growing boy to spend too much time thinking about sad things. And what do you think? Evangeline asked. The question seemed to surprise him. Nobody ever asks what I think. Well, I'm asking. He considered this carefully, his small face serious with concentration. I think forgetting them would be worse than being sad. If I stop thinking about Papa and Mama, who will remember the way Papa laughed when he told jokes, or how Mama sang when she brushed her hair? Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes at the profound wisdom in the child's words. No one, she said softly. Those memories belong to you and they're precious things. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. For the first time since she had entered the room, Teo smiled, a small tentative thing but genuine. Will you tell me another story? She had just begun a tale about a girl who could speak to the wind when footsteps in the corridor announced an approaching presence. Teo's smile vanished instantly, his small body tensing as though preparing for flight. A moment later, Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. Your Grace. Evangeline rose quickly, uncertain whether she was overstepping boundaries she didn't fully understand. Uncle Nat. Teo's cry held a mixture of joy and relief that spoke volumes about his feelings for the man. He scrambled down from the window seat and ran to his uncle, who caught him in an embrace that was both gentle and fierce. Hello, young man, Nathaniel said, his voice softer than Evangeline had ever heard it. I was wondering where you had disappeared to. Evangeline was telling me stories, Teo said, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness. About foxes who can talk to plants and girls who understand the wind. She says it's all right to remember Papa and Mama. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression as his eyes met Evangeline's over the boy's head. She couldn't read what she saw there, but it made her breath catch in her throat. Does she? He said quietly. Well, Evangeline is very wise about such things. Can she tell me more stories? Teo asked, looking between them with hopeful eyes. Nathaniel's gaze lingered on Evangeline for a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually was. I think that could be arranged, he said finally. But first you need to eat some dinner. Mrs. Hartwell has been looking for you. As they prepared to leave, Teo turned back to Evangeline. Will you come back tomorrow? If your uncle says it's all right, she replied, not daring to assume. I say it's all right, Nathaniel said, and there was something in his voice that made her wonder if this arrangement meant more to him than simple kindness to a lonely child. The days that followed established a new rhythm within the castle walls. Each afternoon, after attending to the Duke's medical needs and tending her small garden, Evangeline would find her way to Teo's chamber. Sometimes he would be waiting for her in the window seat, sometimes she would discover him curled up with a book he couldn't quite read, and occasionally she would arrive to find him simply staring out at the grounds with the patient stillness of someone much older than his 6 years. Their time together became a sanctuary of sorts. Evangeline told him stories from Marta's vast collection, tales of brave rabbits and clever sparrows, of trees that whispered secrets and streams that carried wishes to the sea. But more importantly, she listened when he talked about his parents, allowing him to share memories that others had deemed too painful for discussion. Papa used to lift me up to see over the garden walls, Teo told her one afternoon as they sat together watching the gardeners work. He said I needed to know what was growing on the other side in case it was something wonderful that we were missing. That sounds like something a very good papa would do, Evangeline replied, noting how his small face lit up when he spoke of these memories. Mama said he was too curious for his own good, Teo continued, his voice taking on a rhythm that suggested he had replayed these conversations many times in his mind. But she always smiled when she said it. She had the prettiest smile, and when she was really happy she would laugh so hard that Papa would start laughing too, and then I would laugh, and sometimes we would all laugh so much we couldn't remember what was funny in the first place. It was during one of these conversations that Evangeline began to understand the true extent of Teo's isolation. The child had not merely lost his parents. He had lost the right to grieve them openly, to celebrate their memory, to be anything other than a brave little soldier who didn't trouble the adults around him with his sadness. This understanding deepened one evening when she encountered Nathaniel in the corridor outside Teo's room. She had been leaving after their usual story time when she nearly collided with him in the dimly lit hallway. "Your Grace," she said, steadying herself with a hand against the stone wall. "I didn't hear you approach." "I was trying not to disturb you," he admitted, his voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. "I often listen from the corridor when you're with him. He laughs when he's with you, really laughs. I hadn't heard that sound since." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The pain in his voice spoke of his own grief, his own sense of helplessness in the face of a child's suffering. "He needs to remember them," Evangeline said softly. "Not as perfect saints, but as the people who loved him. The people who made him feel safe and cherished and important." Nathaniel nodded slowly. His nurse, she meant well, but she believed that avoiding the subject would help him heal faster. "I thought perhaps she was right. Grief isn't an illness to be cured quickly, Your Grace. It's love with nowhere to go. Teo needs somewhere to put all that love he still carries for his parents." They stood in the shadowy corridor, two adults united in their concern for a child, and Evangeline felt something shift between them. Not the careful formality of healer and patient, but something deeper and more dangerous. A recognition of shared understanding, of values that aligned in ways that had nothing to do with duty or station. "He asks about you when you're not here," Nathaniel said quietly. "Wants to know when you'll come back, whether you might like this story or that game. You've become important to him very quickly." The words carried a weight that made Evangeline's chest tight with something between hope and fear. "Children are resilient, Your Grace. They attach easily when they feel safe." "Is that what this is? Safety?" She looked up at him, this man who had shown her more consideration than anyone in her adult life, who had trusted her with his nephew's wounded heart, who spoke to her as though her thoughts and opinions mattered. "For him? Yes, I think so. And for you?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications she didn't dare examine too closely. In the flickering candlelight of the corridor, his face seemed softer somehow, less guarded than she had ever seen it. This was dangerous territory, she could feel it in the way her heart raced, in the way her careful defenses threatened to crumble. "Your Grace," she began, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Forgive me," he said, stepping back to restore proper distance between them. "That was inappropriate. You're here to help Teo, nothing more. I shouldn't have." "No," she interrupted, surprising them both with her boldness. "You shouldn't have. But I'm glad you did." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Nathaniel inclined his head in a formal bow that somehow felt like retreat. "Good evening, Evangeline," he said, and the way he spoke her name made her wonder if she would ever hear it the same way again. As his footsteps faded down the corridor, Evangeline remained pressed against the stone wall, her heart racing with the knowledge that something fundamental had changed between them, and that there would be no going back to the simple safety of healer and patient. The following morning brought an unexpected disruption to the carefully established rhythms of castle life. Evangeline was in the gardens, gathering fresh chamomile for the Duke's evening tisane, when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the main courtyard. A procession of carriages bearing elaborate crests was making its way through the gates, their occupants clearly people of significant importance. From her position among the herb beds, she watched as elegantly dressed men and women emerged from the vehicles, their clothes speaking of wealth and fashion that made even the Duke's finery seem modest by comparison. Servants hurried to attend them while Pembroke appeared as if summoned by magic, her usual composure intact despite what was clearly an unexpected arrival. "Lady Constance Fairfax," she heard one of the footmen announce, and Evangeline felt something cold settle in her stomach at the name. Even in her isolated world, she had heard of the Fairfax family, one of the most powerful noble houses in the region, with connections that reached all the way to the royal court. The woman who stepped from the lead carriage was everything Evangeline was not. Tall, elegant, with golden hair arranged in perfect coils and a dress that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world, never doubted that doors would open at her approach. "Nathaniel." Lady Constance's voice carried across the courtyard, musical and warm with what seemed like genuine affection. "What a pleasant surprise to find you recovered. We heard you'd been quite ill." Evangeline realized she had been holding her breath, and forced herself to resume her work with the herbs. Whatever this visit meant, it was none of her concern. She was here to tend plants and tell stories to a lonely child, nothing more. But as she tried to focus on her gathering, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was shifting in the castle's dynamics. The easy routine she had fallen into, the comfortable rhythm of her days, suddenly felt as fragile as spider's silk in a storm. It was Teo who provided the explanation she didn't want to seek herself. She found him in his usual window seat that afternoon, but instead of his customary greeting, he looked at her with worried eyes. "Lady Constance is here," he announced without preamble. "Yes, I saw her arrive," Evangeline said carefully, settling into her usual chair. "Do you know her well?" "She's supposed to marry Uncle Nat," Teo said with the matter-of-fact tone children used to deliver devastating news. "Everyone says so. Papa used to say it was a perfect match because their lands touch each other and she's very beautiful and knows how to run a big house." Evangeline felt as though someone had knocked the air from her lungs, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "I see. And what do you think of Lady Constance?" Teo shrugged, but she could see the careful thought behind the gesture. "She's nice enough, I suppose. She always brings me presents when she visits and she says the right things about Papa and Mama. But, she doesn't really see me," he said with startling clarity. "She talks to me like I'm a doll, not a real person. And she makes Uncle Nat different." "Different how?" "Stiffer. More formal. Like he's wearing a mask that doesn't quite fit properly." Teo turned from the window to look at her directly. "He doesn't laugh when she's here. Not really laugh anyway." Before Evangeline could respond, voices in the corridor announced approaching visitors. A moment later, Lady Constance herself appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a blue silk dress that complemented her golden beauty perfectly. Behind her stood Nathaniel, his expression unreadable but somehow distant in a way that made Evangeline's chest ache. "And this must be dear little Teodoro," Lady Constance said, sweeping into the room with practiced grace. "My goodness, how you've grown since I saw you last." Teo stood politely but without enthusiasm, offering a small bow that was perfect in its execution but completely lacking in warmth. "Good afternoon, Lady Constance. I've brought you something special from London," she continued, producing a beautifully wrapped package from seemingly nowhere. "A set of tin soldiers, painted by the finest craftsmen. I thought you might enjoy arranging them for battle." "Thank you," Teo said, accepting the gift with proper gratitude but no real interest. Evangeline noticed he didn't unwrap it. It was then that Lady Constance's attention turned to her, and she felt herself subjected to a scrutiny that was both polite and thoroughly assessing. "And you must be the healer everyone's been talking about. How wonderful that you were able to help Nathaniel recover." "Your ladyship," Evangeline murmured, rising to offer a curtsy that felt clumsy compared to the effortless grace surrounding her. "I understand you've been quite helpful with young Teodoro as well," Lady Constance continued, her smile never wavering but her eyes growing slightly cooler. "How kind of you to spend time entertaining him." There was nothing overtly dismissive in the words, but the message was clear. Evangeline's presence was temporary, charitable, and ultimately insignificant. She was being politely but firmly reminded of her place. "Evangeline tells the best stories," Teo said suddenly, his young voice cutting through the adult undercurrents with startling directness. "She knows ones about foxes who can talk to plants and girls who understand the wind." "How imaginative," Lady Constance said, her tone suggesting that imagination was not necessarily a virtue. "Though I think perhaps it's time for more educational pursuits. I've spoken with your uncle about engaging a proper tutor, someone who can prepare you for the responsibilities of your station." Evangeline felt something inside her go very still and cold. Without looking at Nathaniel, she could sense his discomfort with the conversation, but also his inability, or unwillingness, to contradict his guest. "Stories are educational too," Teo said with remarkable bravery. "They teach you about courage and kindness and how to be clever when you're small." Lady Constance laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow felt sharp against Evangeline's ears. "What a dear child you are. But there will be time enough for such fancies when your real education is complete." The dismissal was complete and devastating. In a few gracious sentences, Lady Constance had made it clear that Evangeline's role in Teo's life, and by extension in the life of the castle, was both temporary and ultimately unimportant. As the elegant lady swept from the room with Nathaniel in tow, Evangeline found herself alone with Teo, both of them staring at the unopened gift on the window seat. "I don't want a tutor," Teo said quietly. "I want more stories about the fox." "And you shall have them," Evangeline promised, though she wondered even as she spoke whether it was a promise she would be able to keep. That evening, Evangeline attended to the Duke's treatment with a heavy heart and careful composure. She prepared his tisane with the same precision as always, checked his breathing with practiced efficiency, and answered his questions about his progress with appropriate medical detachment. But beneath the surface she felt as though she were drowning. Lady Constance's presence had changed everything, casting harsh light on the fragile fantasy she hadn't even realized she'd been constructing. The easy conversations with Nathaniel, the growing warmth between them, the sense of belonging she'd felt while caring for both him and Teo, all of it suddenly seemed like the dangerous delusions of a woman who had forgotten her place in the world. "You're unusually quiet this evening," Nathaniel observed as she finished her ministrations. "Are you feeling well?" "Quite well, Your Grace," she replied, maintaining careful distance as she gathered her supplies. "Your recovery continues excellently. Dr. Whitmore believes you'll be able to resume your full duties within a few days." Something shifted in his expression at her formal tone, but he didn't comment on it directly. "Lady Constance was impressed by your work with Teo. She mentioned that you've been very kind to him." "I'm glad she approves," Evangeline said neutrally, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. She also mentioned her concerns about his education. She believes a more structured approach might be beneficial. Evangeline kept her eyes on her work, afraid that her face might reveal too much. "Of course, Your Grace. Lady Constance would know best about such matters." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Nathaniel spoke again, his voice carefully measured. "She's not wrong about the need for formal education. Teo will inherit significant responsibilities someday. He needs to be prepared." "Certainly, Your Grace. But that doesn't mean there isn't value in other forms of learning as well." Hope fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird, but she forced herself to remain composed. "As you say, Your Grace." Another pause, longer this time. When Nathaniel spoke again, his voice held a note she couldn't quite identify. "Evangeline, is something troubling you? You seem different tonight." The question hung between them, loaded with concern that made her chest ache. For a moment, she was tempted to tell him everything, about the way Lady Constance's arrival had shattered her illusions, about the growing feelings she'd been trying to deny, about the fear that she was about to lose the first place she'd felt truly valued since Marta's death. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and met his eyes with what she hoped was appropriate professionalism. "Nothing troubles me, Your Grace. I was simply reflecting on how much stronger you've become. It's clear that my services here will soon no longer be necessary." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps or disappointment. But before he could respond, voices in the corridor announced another presence. Lady Constance appeared in the doorway, having changed from her traveling clothes into an evening gown that made her look like something from a fairy tale. "I do hope I'm not interrupting," she said with gracious smile. "I thought we might take a turn around the gardens before dinner, Nathaniel. The weather is so lovely, and we have much to discuss about the arrangements for next month." "Arrangements?" he asked, though his eyes remained on Evangeline. "For our engagement announcement, of course," Lady Constance said with a laugh that sounded like music. "Surely you haven't forgotten? Father is hosting a grand ball, and he wants to make the official announcement then. All of London's society will be there." The words hit Evangeline like physical blows, each one driving home the reality she had been trying to ignore. Of course there would be an engagement. Of course there would be a ball. Of course Lady Constance would become the next Duchess of Ravender, bringing her beauty and breeding and political connections to create the perfect noble marriage. "Of course," Nathaniel said, though something in his voice suggested the arrangements were not as settled in his mind as they apparently were in Lady Constance's. "Though perhaps we should discuss the timing." "Oh, there's no need to delay any longer," Lady Constance interrupted with cheerful certainty. "We've been understanding each other for years now, and Father is most eager to formalize the connection between our families. Besides," she added with a meaningful look at Evangeline, "I'm sure everyone is anxious to see proper order restored to this household." The message was unmistakable. Evangeline's time here was ending and everyone, including Nathaniel, needed to accept that reality and move forward with the lives that had been planned for them long before she had stumbled into their world. "I should let you enjoy your evening," Evangeline said, gathering the last of her supplies with hands that she was proud to note remained steady. Your Grace, I believe Dr. Whitmore will be able to handle your remaining care without my assistance. Perhaps it would be best if I made arrangements to leave within the next few days. That's very considerate of you, Lady Constance said warmly, but Evangeline caught the flash of satisfaction in her eyes. Though there's really no rush. I'm sure suitable arrangements can be made for your future. The condescension in the offer, however kindly meant, was almost more than Evangeline could bear. She curtsied to them both, murmured appropriate words of gratitude and farewell, and escaped to the corridor before either could see the tears that threatened to spill over. Behind her, she heard Lady Constance's voice, bright with plans and certainty. Now, about the guest list for the ball. I thought we might invite the Ashfords, such a prominent family, and their support would be valuable. Evangeline didn't wait to hear more. She fled to her chamber, closed the door firmly behind her, and finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with a man who could never be hers, and it was time to leave before that love destroyed them both. Sleep eluded Evangeline that night. She lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the castle settling around her, the distant murmur of voices from the great hall where the Duke and his guest were dining, the soft footsteps of servants in the corridors, the whisper of wind through her small window. Each sound seemed to emphasize how temporary her presence here had always been, how foolish she had been to imagine otherwise. By dawn she had made her decision. She would speak to Pembroke about arrangements for her departure, settle her affairs quietly, and leave without drama or scenes that might embarrass anyone. It was the dignified course of action, the one that would cause the least disruption to lives that would continue quite well without her. But first she owed Teo an explanation. She found him in the breakfast room, picking listlessly at his morning meal while his nurse looked on with worried efficiency. The boy's face brightened when he saw her, and the pure joy in his expression made her chest ache. Evangeline, I was hoping you would come. I wanted to show you something I drew. It's the fox from your story, but I gave him a little bag for carrying herbs like you do. The innocent enthusiasm in his voice nearly undid her resolve entirely. She sat beside him, accepted the carefully folded piece of paper he pressed into her hands, and marveled at the detail in his childish drawing. The fox had wise eyes and a gentle expression, and yes, a small satchel slung across his back just like the one she carried to the gardens. It's beautiful, Teo, she said, meaning every word. You've captured him perfectly. Will you tell me what happens to him next? He asked, leaning closer with the complete trust that children offered so freely and that adults learned to guard so carefully. Evangeline took a breath, knowing that what she said next would matter more than any words she had ever spoken. I think the fox goes on a journey, she said slowly. A long journey to a place where he can help other creatures who need healing. And even though he has to leave friends behind, he knows that the love they shared will stay with him always. Teo's face grew very still as he processed the metaphor. Despite his young age, he had learned to read the subtle languages of loss and abandonment. The fox has to go away? Yes, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean the story ends. It just means that sometimes the best gift we can give people we love is the freedom to follow their own path, even when it takes them away from us. Tears gathered in his dark eyes so much like his uncle's that they made her heart clench. I don't want you to go. The simple honesty of it broke something inside her. She reached out to take his small hands in hers, noting how they trembled slightly with the effort of containing emotions too large for his young heart. I don't want to go either, she admitted. But sometimes what we want and what we need are different things. You're going to have wonderful adventures, Teo. You're going to learn so many things and meet so many people and become the remarkable man I already see inside you. Will I see you again? The question hung between them, and Evangeline knew that any promise she made would likely be false comfort. Noble children and displaced healers did not typically move in the same circles. But looking at his face, she couldn't bring herself to close that door entirely. I hope so, she said instead. But even if our paths don't cross again, you'll always be in my heart. And whenever you see a fox or smell chamomile flowers, or hear the wind telling stories, you can think of me and know that I'm thinking of you too. It was then that a shadow fell across the doorway, and Evangeline looked up to find Nathaniel watching them. His expression was unreadable, but she caught something in his eyes that looked almost like pain. Uncle Nat. Teo called out, though his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. Evangeline says she has to go on a journey, like the fox in her stories. Nathaniel entered the room slowly, his attention shifting between his nephew's tear-streaked face and Evangeline's carefully composed expression. Does she? She says it's what's best. Teo continued with the unconscious cruelty of children repeating difficult truths. But I told her I don't want her to go. And what did she say to that? Teo looked at Evangeline, then back at his uncle. That sometimes what we want and what we need are different things. But Uncle Nat, what if what I need is for her to stay? The question hung in the air between all three of them, charged with implications that went far beyond a child's attachment to his storyteller. Evangeline kept her eyes carefully fixed on her hands, not daring to look at Nathaniel directly, afraid of what she might see in his face. Teo, Nathaniel said carefully, why don't you go find Mrs. Hartwell? I believe she has some lessons prepared for you this morning. But go ahead, his uncle said more firmly. I need to speak with Evangeline privately. Teo looked between them with the sharp awareness that children developed when the adults around them were navigating dangerous emotional territory. But he obeyed, gathering his drawing and leaving them alone with a backward glance that held more worry than any 6-year-old should carry. When the sound of his footsteps had faded, Nathaniel closed the door and turned to face her with an expression she couldn't read. So you've decided to leave, he said without preamble. Yes, Your Grace. I believe it's for the best. Best for whom? The question caught her off guard with its directness. She had expected polite agreement, perhaps even relief that she was removing herself without requiring dismissal. For everyone, Your Grace. Your recovery is complete. Lady Constance has made excellent suggestions for Teo's education, and it's clear that my presence here is no longer necessary. Is that what you think? That your presence is unnecessary? There was something in his tone that made her look up despite her better judgment, meeting eyes that held an intensity she hadn't expected. What I think doesn't matter, Your Grace. What matters is that you have obligations, responsibilities, a future that was planned long before I arrived. Lady Constance is everything you need in a wife, and Teo deserves stability and proper guidance, not stories from a woman with no real place in his world. And what about what you deserve? The question hit her like a physical blow. No one had asked her that in years, not since Marta's death, possibly not ever. Your Grace. What do you deserve, Evangeline? What do you want from life? She stared at him, unable to process the question or the way he was looking at her, as though her answer actually mattered to him. I don't understand. It's a simple question. What would make you happy? The words came out before she could stop them. This? Being here, helping Teo remember that it's all right to grieve, working in the gardens, feeling useful and valued, and... She caught herself before she could say the rest, before she could admit that what would make her happiest was the impossible dream of remaining in this place with these people who had somehow become home. And, he prompted softly. She shook her head, unable to finish the thought aloud. It doesn't matter what I want, Your Grace. Some things are simply impossible. Are they? He asked, and there was something in his voice that made her heart race with dangerous hope. The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Evangeline felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to decipher the meaning behind his words, the expression in his eyes that seemed to hold possibilities she didn't dare name. Your Grace, she began carefully, I think perhaps we're both allowing emotion to cloud our judgment. You have duties, obligations. What if I told you, Nathaniel interrupted, stepping closer, that I've spent the last 3 days trying to convince myself that my duty lies with Lady Constance? That the engagement everyone expects is the right course for the dukedom, for Teo, for everyone involved. Evangeline's breath caught. And have you convinced yourself? A bitter smile touched his lips. No. Every rational argument I make crumbles the moment I think about you leaving. Every time I imagine Lady Constance as mistress of this castle, all I can think is that the gardens would lose their magic, Teo would lose his laughter, and I would lose. He stopped, running a hand through his dark hair in frustration. What would you lose? She whispered. The only woman who has ever looked at me and seen just a man, not a title or an opportunity. The only person who makes me want to be better than I am, not for duty or honor, but simply because you believe I already am. The words hit her like lightning, illuminating feelings she had kept carefully buried. But even as her heart soared, her practical mind reasserted itself. It doesn't matter what we feel, Your Grace. The world doesn't care about the feelings of a duke and a displaced healer. There are expectations, obligations. And what if I choose to disappoint those expectations? Before she could respond, rapid footsteps in the corridor announced an approaching crisis. The door burst open to reveal Lady Constance, her usually perfect composure shattered by obvious distress. Nathaniel, thank heavens you're here, she exclaimed, then stopped short as she took in the scene before her, the Duke and his healer standing close together, tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Constance, what's wrong? Nathaniel asked, immediately stepping back to a more appropriate distance. It's father, she said, her voice shaking. A messenger just arrived. He's had an apoplectic fit, a stroke, the physicians believe. They don't know if he'll survive, and even if he does. She pressed a hand to her mouth, struggling for composure. I must return to London immediately. The carriages are being prepared now. Evangeline watched the interplay of emotions across Nathaniel's face, concern, calculation, and something that might have been relief warring for dominance. His honor would not allow him to abandon Lady Constance in her crisis, regardless of his personal feelings. Of course, he said immediately. I'll accompany you. My steward can handle affairs here for a few weeks. Oh, Nathaniel, would you? Lady Constance's gratitude was evident and genuine. I know it's a terrible imposition, but with father so ill, and all the business arrangements that will need attention. Say no more. We'll leave within the hour. As the two began discussing travel arrangements, Evangeline quietly moved toward the door. This was not her crisis, not her decision to make. But Lady Constance's voice stopped her. Miss Evangeline, she called, her tone warmer than it had been previously. I wanted to thank you before I leave for your kindness to Teodoro. And to Nathaniel. You've been more helpful than I initially realized. There was something in the lady's eyes that suggested she understood more about the situation than she had let on. Not jealousy, exactly, but a resigned recognition that the engagement everyone had assumed was settled was perhaps more complicated than it had appeared. I wish you and your father well, my lady, Evangeline replied sincerely. I hope his recovery is swift and complete. As do I. Lady Constance paused, then added with careful deliberation. You know, it's interesting how crises have a way of clarifying what truly matters to us. Sometimes what we think we want and what we actually need turn out to be very different things. The words seemed directed as much at Nathaniel as at Evangeline, and when the Duke's eyes met hers across the room, she saw her own confusion and hope reflected in his gaze. An hour later, Evangeline stood at her window watching the carriages depart, taking with them the woman who should have been the next Duchess of Ravender and the man whose feelings for her had turned her carefully ordered world upside down. As the procession disappeared through the castle gates, she tried to convince herself that this departure was for the best, that distance would restore perspective and allow them all to return to their proper places in the world. But deep in her heart, she knew that something fundamental had shifted, and that when Nathaniel returned, if he returned, nothing would ever be quite the same. That evening, she sat with Teo as he picked at his dinner, both of them trying to adjust to the strange emptiness that had settled over the castle. Do you think Uncle Nat will come back? He asked quietly. Of course he will, Evangeline assured him, though she wondered if her own certainty was as fragile as it felt. This is his home and you're here. He would never abandon you. But what if Lady Constance needs him to stay in London? What if they get married there and she doesn't want to come back? The questions echoed Evangeline's own fears, but she forced her voice to remain steady. Your uncle is a man of honor, Teo. Whatever decisions he makes, they'll be the right ones for everyone involved. As she spoke the words, she tried to believe them herself. But as night fell over Ravender Castle, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all balanced on the edge of a precipice, and that the choices made in the coming days would determine whether they found solid ground or tumbled into the abyss. 3 weeks passed in a state of suspended animation. Letters arrived sporadically from London, brief updates on Lord Fairfax's condition, mentions of business matters requiring attention, polite inquiries about Teo's welfare. But the letters said nothing about Nathaniel's own state of mind, nothing about when he might return, and most tellingly, nothing about wedding arrangements or engagement announcements. Evangeline found herself caught in a strange limbo. She had announced her intention to leave, but with the Duke absent and no clear instructions about Teo's care, her departure seemed indefinitely postponed. The castle staff treated her with a deference that suggested they expected her to remain, while she continued to tell herself she was only staying until proper arrangements could be made. Teo, for his part, seemed to sense the uncertainty surrounding him. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours staring out his window toward the road that would herald his uncle's return. Their daily story sessions continued, but even the most adventurous tales couldn't completely lift the shadow of worry that had settled over the young boy. It was Dr. Whitmore who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. Strange business, this extended absence, he remarked one afternoon as Evangeline helped him prepare medications in the castle's small infirmary. One might expect a duke to attend to such family matters more expeditiously, particularly with his own household requiring attention. Lord Fairfax's condition must be more serious than initially reported, Evangeline replied carefully. Perhaps. Or perhaps, the doctor said with the meaningful look of someone who had observed more than he usually admitted. His Grace finds himself reconsidering certain arrangements that once seemed settled. Before Evangeline could respond to this loaded observation, commotion in the courtyard drew their attention to the window. A single rider was approaching at considerable speed, his horse lathered with sweat and his posture suggesting urgent business. A messenger, Dr. Whitmore observed. And by the look of him, not bearing routine correspondence. They watched as the rider dismounted and was immediately escorted inside by Pembroke herself, an unusual honor that suggested the message he carried was of significant importance. Within minutes, a footman appeared at the infirmary door. Miss Evangeline, he said with unusual formality, Mrs. Pembroke requests your immediate presence in the library. Evangeline's heart began to race as she followed the footman through corridors that suddenly felt longer than usual. The library door stood open, revealing Pembroke at her most commanding, a sealed letter in her hands and an expression that gave away nothing of its contents. Please sit, the housekeeper said, gesturing to a chair near the window. I've received word from His Grace. Lord Fairfax has passed away, and the funeral is to be held tomorrow. His Grace will be remaining in London for an additional week to assist Lady Constance with the settlement of her father's affairs. Evangeline absorbed this information with appropriate sympathy for Lady Constance's loss, but she sensed there was more to come. Pembroke confirmed her intuition by continuing with careful deliberation. However, His Grace has also sent specific instructions regarding the household. He wishes Master Teodoro to continue his current educational arrangements, specifically his afternoon sessions with you, until further notice. He has also requested that you remain at Ravender Castle indefinitely, with a permanent position as companion and tutor to Master Teodoro. The words hit Evangeline like a physical blow. A permanent position. At Ravender Castle. With Teo. She stared at Pembroke, trying to process the implications. Did His Grace mention Lady Constance's feelings about these arrangements? She managed to ask. Lady Constance, Pembroke said with the slightest emphasis on the title, is, according to His Grace's letter, in complete agreement that Master Teodoro's welfare should be the primary consideration. She has, apparently, released His Grace from their understanding, believing that their mutual grief has shown them both that they are better suited as friends than as spouses. Evangeline felt the world tilt around her. She broke the engagement? There was, it appears, never a formal engagement to break. Merely an understanding between families that has now been reconsidered. Pembroke's eyes held a gleam that might have been satisfaction. His Grace will be returning to Ravender at the end of next week. He requests that you consider his offer carefully and provide your answer upon his arrival. As if in a dream, Evangeline found herself walking back through the castle corridors, Pembroke's words echoing in her mind. A permanent position. An end to her wandering, her uncertainty. A chance to watch Teo grow, to tend her gardens, to build a life in this place that had come to feel like home. But beneath the joy was a current of something more complex and dangerous. What did this offer really mean? Was it simply the practical solution of a guardian who recognized his nephew's attachment to his caregiver? Or was it something more? An invitation not just to remain as Teo's companion, but to explore what might develop between a duke who had discovered his freedom and a healer who had found her place in the world? That evening, she sat with Teo as he practiced his letters, watching his small face concentrate on forming each character with careful precision. When he looked up and caught her studying him, he smiled with genuine happiness for the first time in weeks. Uncle Nat is coming home, he said with satisfaction. And you're staying forever. How do you know that? She asked, surprised by his certainty. Because that's how the best stories end, he said simply. The fox finds where he belongs and everyone who loves him gets to be together. As Evangeline looked at this wise, wounded child who had already learned so much about loss and hope, she realized that perhaps he understood the situation better than any of the adults involved. Some stories did end with belonging. Some foxes did find their way home. The question now was whether she was brave enough to believe in that kind of ending for herself. Nathaniel returned to Ravender on a gray October morning when mist clung to the castle walls like gossamer and the gardens showed the first hints of autumn's approach. Evangeline watched from her window as his carriage wound up the familiar drive, her heart hammering against her ribs with an intensity that made breathing difficult. She had spent the week of his absence in careful contemplation, weighing every aspect of his offer with the methodical precision she usually reserved for preparing medicines. A permanent position at Ravender would provide security she had never known, meaningful work she genuinely loved, and the chance to watch Teo grow into the remarkable man she already glimpsed beneath his careful composure. But beneath these practical considerations lay deeper questions she barely dared examine. What did Nathaniel truly want from her? What did she want from him? And was it possible for a duke and a displaced healer to build something real together, or was she allowing hope to obscure the fundamental impossibilities of their situation? Her reverie was interrupted by rapid footsteps in the corridor, followed by Teo's voice calling her name with unfettered joy. She opened her door to find him practically vibrating with excitement. "He's back. Uncle Nat is back. He's asking for you in the library right away." The boy's happiness was infectious, and despite her nervousness, Evangeline found herself smiling at his enthusiasm. "Let me gather myself for a moment," she said, smoothing her simple dress and checking that her hair was properly pinned. "You look perfect," Teo assured her with the earnest conviction of childhood. "Uncle Nat will think so too." The innocent statement sent heat racing through her cheeks, but before she could respond, Teo had taken her hand and was pulling her toward the stairs with the determination of a child who had waited long enough for his favorite adults to sort out their complicated feelings. She found Nathaniel standing before the library's great window, still in his traveling clothes, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the journey. When he turned at her approach, she was struck by how the weeks in London had changed him, not physically, but in some subtle way that spoke of decisions made and certainties found. "Evangeline," he said, and the way he spoke her name made her breath catch. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Your Grace," she replied, falling back on formality to steady herself. "I hope your journey was comfortable. Please accept my condolences on Lord Fairfax's passing." "Thank you." "It was peaceful in the end, and Lady Constance bore it with remarkable strength." He paused, his eyes never leaving her face. "She asked me to convey her regards to you and to Teo. She hopes you'll both be very happy here at Ravender." The words carried clear implications that made Evangeline's heart race. "That's very kind of her, Your Grace." "She's a remarkable woman," Nathaniel continued, moving closer with careful deliberation. "Intelligent, compassionate, well-suited to the demands of noble life. She'll make someone an excellent wife someday, someone who can love her as she deserves to be loved, rather than simply appreciating her considerable qualities. Your Grace. I realized during those weeks in London," he continued as though she hadn't spoken, "that I was preparing to marry a woman I respected and admired, but whom I didn't love. And more importantly, who didn't love me. We were both settling for a comfortable arrangement that would have satisfied everyone except ourselves." Evangeline stared at him, afraid to breathe, afraid to hope, afraid to believe where this conversation seemed to be leading. "But that realization led to a more difficult question," Nathaniel said, stopping directly in front of her. "What did I want for myself? What kind of life would make me truly happy, rather than simply fulfilled in my duties?" "And what answer did you reach?" she whispered. "That I want a life with someone who sees past my title to the man beneath. Someone who challenges me to be better, who brings laughter into dark corners, who turns a castle into a home." His voice grew softer, more vulnerable. "Someone who loves a lonely child not for his inheritance but for his brave heart. Someone who finds magic in ordinary moments and makes me believe in possibilities I never dared imagine." Tears blurred her vision as she looked up at him, seeing in his face the same hope and uncertainty she felt in her own heart. "Your Grace." "Nathaniel," he corrected gently. "Just Nathaniel. No titles, no formality, just two people trying to figure out if they're brave enough to choose love over expectation." "The world won't understand," she said, voicing her deepest fear. "A duke and a healer. The world will have to adjust," he said with quiet determination. "I've spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, being who others needed me to be. For once, I want to choose what makes me happy. If you'll have me." The simple words hung between them, an invitation and a question and a promise all wrapped together. Evangeline thought of all the reasons why this was impossible, impractical, potentially disastrous for them both. Then she thought of Teo's wise words about how the best stories ended, of the gardens she loved tending, of the way Nathaniel looked when he laughed, of the life they could build together if they were brave enough to try. "Yes," she said, the word barely more than a breath. "Yes, I'll have you." His smile was radiant as he reached for her hands, and when he spoke again, his voice held wonder and gratitude and joy. "Then will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of being Teo's mother and my partner and the Duchess of Ravender?" Before she could answer, the library door burst open to admit Teo, who had clearly been listening at the keyhole despite any instructions to the contrary. "She said yes," he announced with triumph, as though he had orchestrated the entire conversation. I heard her say yes. Nathaniel laughed, the sound rich and free and completely unguarded. Then I suppose it's settled. We're to be a family. As Teo launched himself at both of them, wrapping his small arms around them with fierce happiness, Evangeline felt something settle into place in her heart. A sense of belonging, of purpose, of love that was both deeper and simpler than anything she had ever imagined. Later, much later, when Teo had been convinced to leave them alone for a few minutes and they stood together in the gathering dusk, Nathaniel asked her quietly, "Do you think you'll be happy here? Truly happy?" Evangeline looked around the library with its warm light and comfortable chairs, thought of the gardens waiting for her care and the child who would grow up calling her mother and the man who loved her despite every rational argument against it. "I think," she said, leaning into the warmth of his embrace, "that I've found exactly where I belong." And as the stars began to appear over Ravender Castle, three people who had each known loss and loneliness discovered that sometimes the best stories really do end with coming home.